Well, good evening. I'm Michael Naughton, the director of the Center for Catholic Studies. And on behalf of the University of St. Thomas and its leadership, particularly our president, Julie Sullivan, our provost, Richard Plum, Dr. Terry Langen, who's the Dean of the Arts and Sciences, it is indeed an honor to welcome you to the University of St. Thomas. This lecture by Mr. John Allen is part of a 3-day interdisciplinary seminar on human and natural ecology and its economic, political, and cultural implications. The seminar is sponsored by the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, Department of Justice and Peace and Human Development, the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, and the University of St. Thomas's Center for Catholic Studies and the School of Divinity. The genesis of this seminar came out of a conversation with the sponsors to begin to articulate the relationship between natural and human ecology within the Catholic social tradition so as to prepare for the reception of Pope Francis's first social encyclical on this topic, which is due out in the next 2 weeks. This relationship between human and natural ecology has been described by Cardinal Turkson as an integral ecology, which seems to be primed to become the major idea of this encyclical. There are few encyclicals, papal encyclicals, more anticipated than this one by Francis. But there is a general concern that it will become politicized, that its full reception will be garbled, and that the central idea of an integral ecology will become lost to the bantering of left and right. Both the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace and the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops encouraged us to start reflecting on what the Church already teaches, which could serve as a soil in which the encyclical can be better planted. So that's a bit of the background about why we invited John Allen to open up this seminar. And at this time, what I'd like to do is invite Dr. Jonathan Reyes, one of our co-sponsors, to introduce Mr. Allen today. Dr. Jonathan Reyes is a good friend of the University of St. Thomas. He is the executive director of the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops. He is in the Department of Justice, Peace, and Human Development. He is the former president of Catholic Charities in Denver, and he's also been a newly appointed member to the advisory board at the Catholic Studies, Center for Catholic Studies here at St. Thomas, and he's a great friend. So Jonathan, please give a warm welcome to Jonathan.
Thank you, Michael. It's a delight to be here. I actually also had the privilege of teaching for a semester here as part of the Catholic Studies program and get to know the university. If there's any students out there, you made the right choice. It's a great place to study. I have the privilege, I want to thank the university for its hospitality. I want to thank especially Catholic Studies and the St. Paul Seminary for their hospitality and in taking up the challenge we issued to please help us think through some of these issues in terms of how the encyclical will be received. But my job this evening is to introduce John Allen. Before I read his biography, or pieces of it, I just would simply note this will be the 3rd time I have introduced John Allen in a public setting. It's become sort of a career for me. The first time was in Denver in front of about, I think, 3,000 people where John gave a very excellent talk. The second time was in Washington, D.C., where John spoke to people from all over the country who had come for a special conference on the church's social mission. And he did a great job, and so we went from Denver to D.C., and now the culmination of this trifecta, I am at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minneapolis. It is really great to be here. I did mention to John, I've done this will be my 3rd time I introduced him. He said, well, I'd like you to get it right this time, because you don't say enough nice things about me. So we're going to fix that tonight. John Allen is the associate editor of the Boston Globe. He spent 16 years as prize-winning senior correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter. John serves as a senior Vatican analyst for CNN, is the author of 7 best-selling books on the Vatican and Catholic affairs, and writes frequently on the Church for major national and international publications. He's also a popular speaker on Catholic affairs, both in the United States and abroad. The London Tablet has called John the most authoritative writer on Vatican affairs in the English language, and renowned papal biographer George Weigel has called him the best Anglophone Vatican reporter ever. When he was called upon to put the first question to Pope Benedict XVI aboard the papal plane en route to the United States in April of 2008, the Vatican spokesperson said to the Pope, "Holy Father, this man needs no introduction." That's not just a Vatican judgment. Veteran religion writer Kenneth Woodward of Newsweek described Allen as a journalist other reporters and not a few cardinals look to for the inside story on how all the Pope's men direct the world's largest church. His most recent book is The Global War on Christians, Dispatches from the Front Lines of Anti-Christian Persecution. If you haven't read it, you should. John divides his time between Rome and his home in Denver, Colorado. He grew up in western Kansas and holds a master's degree in religious studies from the University of Kansas. Please join me in welcoming our guest this evening, Mr. John Allen.
Hello there. Can everyone hear? Outstanding. Well, listen, I know it is the normal sort of fare for a speaker to start these presentations by talking about how delighted they are to be wherever it is they happen to be. And a lot of the time that is kind of pro forma, but I can promise you I actually am truly delighted to be here tonight. One reason is because I'm among so many old friends. First of all, I think this is my third time speaking on this campus, and it's been a great experience every time. Secondly, this Human and Natural Ecology Conference has brought together so many people that I have been privileged to know over the years. I'd begin the list with Archbishop Thomas Winsky from Miami. If you don't know him, he's one of the great heroes of the American Catholic Church, and by the way, rides a mean Harley Davidson. Michael Naughton from UST, a good friend of mine and someone whose work I've admired so much over the years. Jonathan Reyes, obviously, both of us veterans of the Charlie Chaput Social Club in the Archdiocese of Denver. Father Manny Durantes, who I know from the Sala Stampa and Points Beyond, and so many others I'm forgetting. So I feel like I'm sort of among family here tonight. Let me tell you the other reason I am delighted to be here. Which is the powers that be at this conference have asked me to talk about an event that has not yet happened, which is the release of Pope Francis's Encyclical on the environment. And the great thing about future predictions, ladies and gentlemen, is that in the moment you utter them, you cannot possibly be wrong. And by the time the encyclical actually comes out, everyone will have forgotten whatever it is I said about it. So it's sort of reminiscent of what Bob Dole once said about being Vice President of the United States. It's indoor work and there's no heavy lifting. That's kind of how I feel about the presentation here tonight. So what I thought I would do is, because as Michael accurately said, this is probably the most anticipated, commented upon, digested, dissected papal document in recent memory before its release, so much so that I frankly think that when it does appear, in the date, although it's not been officially confirmed, but the date of release is reportedly the 16th of June, that it's actually going to be anticlimactic almost when the encyclical actually comes out, but there's been so much exegesis of it before the fact. So rather than giving you one more set of commentary about what to expect from the encyclical in terms of its actual content, what I thought I would do tonight is something slightly different. I am, after all, a journalist. I'm a media professional, so I thought I would do a bit of media analysis with you here tonight and talk about 4 ways in which I expect that this encyclical is going to be misunderstood, miscast, misinterpreted, and misrepresented. In other words, I'm going to try to help you get ahead of the spin. Okay? But before we come to that, I am, after all, a reporter. And if you have a right to expect anything at all from a reporter, you at least have the right to expect that we should get our facts right. So I'd like to begin tonight with a fact. Not a hunch, not a theory, not an anecdotal impression, but a hardcore, empirical, take it to the bank, you can hang your hat on it fact. And that fact is that as of today, Pope Francis is by far the most popular spiritual leader on the planet and one of the most popular leaders of any sort, and therefore anything he says on any subject, including the environment, is destined to have a massive cultural impact. Now, there are a variety of ways I could illustrate that fact to you. Let's begin with this. Do you people know that recently Pope Francis just crossed the 12 million mark in terms of his following on Twitter? Now, this makes him easily the most followed religious figure on Twitter, and one of the most followed people of all sorts, although not yet the most followed human being in absolute terms on Twitter. You all know who that is? Okay, shout on a name. Who you got? Justin Bieber is a good guess, but bam, not quite right. Ladies and gentlemen, as of today, the single most followed person on Twitter is Katy Perry. Rounding out the top 5 are Barack Obama, Taylor Swift, Justin Bieber, and Lady Gaga. And yes, surely the apocalypse cannot be far behind. But look, give the poor Pope a break. He's only been on Twitter 2.5 years. I mean, this is not bad, 12 million. Or we could talk about his poll numbers. Again, it is a fact that this Pope, in every corner of the world where public opinion can be scientifically measured, this Pope has approval ratings that politicians or celebrities would sacrifice their children to pagan gods to obtain. Okay, consider the most recent USA Today Gallup poll in the United States, which found that overall, among Americans generally, Catholics and not, Pope Francis has a 79% approval rating. Now, if you don't think Barack Obama would take that number and run screaming into the night with it, you have not been paying attention to American politics. And most interestingly to me is that the Pope has a 90%, that's 90% approval rating among American Catholics. Okay? Now, sit with that number for a minute, 90%. And put that in the context of what we all know about how badly divided the American Catholic Church is on virtually everything. I mean, the truth of it is, under ordinary circumstances, it would be tough to get 90% of American Catholics to agree that today is Wednesday, right? Because on the right, there would be some camp that thinks we should still be following the Julian calendar. And, you know, on the left, there would be someone who suspects a hierarchical plot to control our sense of time. Okay? So in that context, the fact that this Pope has a 90% approval rating is nothing short of mind-blowing. And frankly, when we get around to beatifying and canonizing Jorge Mario Bergoglio, I would submit this could count as his first miracle. And by the way, if there are any canonists in the room, yes, I know, for sainthood causes, the miracles have to come after death, but it's a good line. Give me a break. And by the way, I mean, as a footnote to that observation, let me just say that the truly interesting thing about that poll to me was when you drill down, what you find is that 92% of self-identified conservative Catholics in the United States give this Pope a favorable rating. 87% of self-identified moderate to liberal Catholics do so. So the mythology we've created about conservative blowback to the Pope, at least in the United States on the basis of this poll, seems to me a bit exaggerated. Point being, he has massive support. Or, you know, we could talk about what a media icon he has become, all the magazine covers he's been on, right? I mean, this guy has been on the cover of Time magazine. He was their Person of the Year. He was on the cover, I mean, for God's sake, ladies and gentlemen, he was on the cover of the Rolling Stone. And yes, I did buy 5 copies for my mother, for those of you who are old enough to get the Dr. Hook reference. You know, but actually, the most interesting example of a magazine cover he's been on was Vanity Fair. Do you know the first publication in the world to declare him its Person of the Year was the Italian edition of Vanity Fair, which included a tribute to the Pope from that well-known Vatican expert Elton John, who described the Pope as, quote, a miracle of humility in an era of vanity. Miracle of humility in an era of vanity. I mean, Vanity Fair, folks, this is not exactly a house organ of the Catholic Church, right? So the point is that this Pope has become, in many ways, a kind of cultural phenomenon, which creates all sorts of opportunities for those of us who live and move and have our being in the church. I mean, we've been talking about the project of a new evangelization for the last 20 years. I would submit to you we will never have a better missionary calling card than we have right now in the form of Pope Francis, because for once, the outside world is looking at the church not through the lens of scandal, crisis, and suspicion, but with sympathetic interest. Okay? It also means that everything Francis says and does, and I do mean, and I speak now as a media professional, absolutely everything he says and does is going to be the subject of intense worldwide interest. Now, when you package that with a debate that is as politically divisive and socially and economically sensitive as the debate over global warming and climate change, when you have a pop culture sensation pope pronouncing on what is arguably the most contentious political issue of our time, it is inevitably destined to be a sensation. Okay? And that is, of course, what brings us together here tonight. Now, I would suggest to you that when this encyclical appears, and as I say, it is tentatively slated to come out on the 16th of this month, when it appears, there are actually going to be two papal encyclicals. There's going to be the actual encyclical that Francis writes and the Vatican publishes, the title of which reportedly is Laudato Si', praised be, okay, the opening line of a famous canticle. So there will be that encyclical that Francis actually produces, and then there will be the encyclical that is presented to you, packaged for you, shaped for you, and in some ways distorted for you by the global media industry. Okay? So what I want to do tonight is give you my 4 predictions for the top 4 distortions, misrepresentations, and miscastings of the encyclical that we are likely to see when it actually comes out. Let me briefly tick off the 4 for you, and then I will unpack each in turn. So 1, first misimpression, the encyclical is going to be understood as a political manifesto, a political document. Secondly, it is going to be seen as a radical break with Catholic tradition. Third, it is going to be understood as a historic reconciliation between the church and science. And fourth, it is going to be seen as confirmation that Pope Francis is a flaming pinko liberal. Okay? Well, let me take each one of those in turn. Okay? First, the idea that this document is going to be a political manifesto. Let me predict for you, ladies and gentlemen, and go on Google the morning of June 16th and see if I'm right. But I suspect the headlines around the world are going to be something like the following. Pope backs push for strong limits on greenhouse gases. Okay? Now, look, it is not as if that is entirely wrong. I suspect that element is indeed going to be in Laudato Si'. And in this case, I'm not just giving you predictions because Francis is already on record on this subject. I was on the papal plane with the pontiff when we were flying from Colombo in Sri Lanka to Manila in the Philippines this past January. And Francis, you may know, has the tendency to do these airborne press conferences, okay, where he just comes to the back of the plane and will take any question under the sun. As I always say about traveling with the Pope, in many ways, it's nothing to write home about. The seats are uncomfortable, the food is mediocre, but ladies and gentlemen, the in-flight entertainment is spectacular. Okay, and on this occasion, he took a question about climate change. And we asked him, Holy Father, do you believe in climate change and do you believe it's man-made? And his answer was, yes, I believe in climate change, and yes, I believe it is mostly caused by human activity. In fact, his soundbite was, it is man who has slapped nature around. Okay, that was the line. That was the soundbite. So he is already on record, and I suspect all of that is also going to be of the encyclical. So the headlines you are going to see, in a certain sense, are not going to be inaccurate. That point will be contained in the document. But as you all know, the first key to understanding any text is accurately ascertaining its literary genre. You have to know what kind of text it is in order to be able to understand it appropriately. I guarantee you, this text is not going to be a political tractate. It is instead going to be fundamentally a work in moral theology, okay, in which the beating heart of the text, taking its point of departure from biblical teaching about God's creation and Christian tradition, okay, the central question is going to be how a Christian approaches the issue of the common good, and therefore how a Christian ought to react, ought to interact with other people and with the created world. Okay? And further, I also guarantee you that the primary point of this encyclical is not going to be to shape global climate change conventions. Now, again, again, it's not that that isn't part of the agenda here, not part of the subtext. Going back to that airborne press conference in January, we also asked the Pope, when is the document going to come out? And he said it's going to come out in the early summer because I want it to help set the table for the UN Climate Change Summit in Paris later this year. And he said, I hope it encourages them to make more courageous decisions. So it is not inaccurate to say that Pope Francis wants this encyclical to promote more dramatic action with regard to climate change and global warming. But I guarantee you that the fundamental audience is not going to be the titans of the earth sitting around an oak table in Paris debating some global convention. The primary audience, ladies and gentlemen, is instead going to be all of us. It's individual hearts and minds all over the world. I suspect that the Pope is going to make a strong pitch that if we truly care about the environment, then what we need to do, all of us, is embrace lifestyles that are humbler, simpler, and therefore ultimately more sustainable. And he's not going to, in the first instance, going to be relying upon political systems or global treaties to accomplish that. The appeal is going to be to the individual person. Okay? Final point in terms of why this is not going to be a political document is that I think you have to understand something about the worldview of Jorge Mario Bergoglio, that is the man who is now Pope Francis, which is that during his adult life, he has seen various ideological systems wash through his home continent of Latin America. He has seen the promise of left-wing Marxist guerrilla insurrection in the 60s and 70s. He has seen the promise of neoliberal economics in the 90s. He has seen regimes of both left and the right promising a new heaven and a new earth. And his experience has taught him to be inveterately skeptical of all of them. In the first place, he believes that social change does not come through political organization or mass movements. It comes through reaching the individual person, reaching inside the heart and the mind of individual believers and opening them up to new possibilities. That, ladies and gentlemen, is this Pope's agenda writ large, and I suspect it will also be the agenda of Laudato Si'. Okay? So that's point one. This is going to be presented to you as a political document. Take it from me. There will be political elements, but fundamentally it is going to be an individual appeal cast at the moral and spiritual level. All right. Secondly, this is going to be presented to you as a dramatic break from Catholic tradition, okay? A reversal of centuries of Christian Catholic indifference to environmental welfare. Here's the thing you need to know from a media point of view. We in the media business have created this narrative of Pope Francis as a great maverick. And it's not that that's entirely wrong, let me be clear. I mean, I have said before that I think this Pope ought to come with a warning label like a pack of cigarettes that reads, "Caution, predictions are hazardous to your health." I mean, it is true. You never know from day to day what this guy is going to do. But on the other hand, the danger of that maverick label is that it often induces people to believe that absolutely everything Francis says and does is somehow revolutionary, right? That it's somehow novel, that it's somehow unprecedented. And the truth of it is that is not at all generally the case, and it is certainly not the case here. Ladies and gentlemen, let me put this to you in a soundbite. The Pope's encyclical on the environment is not going to be a reversal of Catholic tradition. Ladies and gentlemen, it is the tradition. Okay? Now, to establish that, if you want, we could go all the way back to St. Francis of Assisi, right, in terms of finding this green impulse in Catholic spirituality and his famous canticles to Brother Sun and Sister Moon. We could bring the story further in time to the 19th century and the father of modern genetics, Gregor Mendel, an Austrian Augustinian monk. We could talk about the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, which in its present form dates from the 19th century, but traces its roots actually back to a famous Italian scientific academy that was founded in 1603. We could talk about the Vatican Observatory, which over the decades has sponsored some of the most cutting-edge astrological research. I mean, the basic point here is that while there have certainly been occasional moments of tension between the church and the scientific world, I would defy you to find any institution on the planet over the last 5 centuries that has been a greater patron of scientific inquiry than the Catholic Church. I don't think it exists. And now I get where the mythology comes from, folks. I mean, I get where this impression comes from of some kind of, deep-seated rivalry between religion and science. I don't know how many of you in this room are Simpsons fans. I'm a huge Simpsons fan. There's a great episode where Lisa Simpson, that's the daughter if you don't watch the show, finds a set of bones which looks like a human skeleton but has wings attached to it, and so the conclusion is drawn that this must be the remains of an angel. And then in great American fashion, the debate arises, well, who actually owns these remains? And then it consumes most of the show. But at the end of it, there's a judge who rules on ownership, and then he issues a restraining order. And he says, at the end, he says, and further, I am ordering that religion must stay 500 yards away from science at all times. Okay, so I get where this notion that there has to be some kind of inherent conflict here comes from, but if you take a close look at Catholic history, I can guarantee you that is simply not the case. Now, if we want to bring this narrative closer into time, okay, let's look at the 2 popes who preceded Pope Francis, John Paul II and Benedict XVI. John Paul II, in 1990, devoted an entire message for the Church's World Day of Peace to ecological themes. So when you read that this is the first papal document ever devoted to the environment, false. Okay, it's the first encyclical devoted to the environment. But John Paul devoted that 1990 message to environmental themes in which not only did he applaud the contemporary growth in ecological awareness, but he referred to global warming and man-made impact on the environment as a problem, and this is his language, that has reached the proportions of a crisis. Before the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of the United Nations was on this subject, ladies and gentlemen, John Paul was telling you we have an ecological crisis. Okay? And certainly when it comes to Benedict XVI, I mean, when I say to you that Benedict XVI oh, and I forgot about John Paul. He also signed an ecological declaration with Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople in 2002, the first among equals in the Orthodox world, in which the 2 men called upon humanity to repent. That was their language. We are calling upon humanity to repent for the damage it has inflicted on the natural world. Now, when we come to Benedict XVI, when I say to you that whole books could be written about Benedict's environmental teaching, I am not trafficking in metaphors. There actually was a book written in 2010 about Benedict's environmental teaching, which dubbed him the Green Pope for all of the various statements he had made. We could, for example, look at his 2010 message on the environment, in which Benedict XVI argued that there will be no peace and there will be no justice in the postmodern world until there is a stronger sense of ecological awareness. We could look at his famous social encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, in which an entire section is devoted to protection of the environment and the intrinsic link between that and human ecology, which is, of course, the topic of this conference. But it's not just that Benedict talked the talk, he also walked the walk. Ladies and gentlemen, I was standing in the Aula Paolo VI, which is where popes hold their Wednesday general audience during the winter when the weather is bad, when Benedict XVI flipped on the switch to begin generating electrical current from the solar panels he had installed on top of that building, to the point, and there's actually a little meter there right inside the main door when you can see how much current the Vatican is actually feeding into the Italian electrical grid because of those solar panels. I actually remember the lead of the story I wrote that day, which was, for 2 millennia, the Catholic Church has drawn on the power of the sun, S-O-N, but as of today, it's also drawing on the power of the sun, S-U-N. Huh? Come on. Thank you. Benedict also signed an agreement to replant a section of a forest in Hungary to such an extent that it actually made the Vatican Europe's first carbon-neutral state. That happened in 2008, and in that year, the German Green Party gave him the Environmentalist of the Year award. So the notion that Pope Francis's environmental concern is somehow, springing forward out of nothing, like Athena out of the head of Zeus, is just a total misrepresentation both of the distant past and the present. Francis is certainly carrying that tradition forward, obviously issuing an entire encyclical, which is the most developed and in some ways the most, although canonists would dispute this, but in some ways the most authoritative form of papal teaching. Obviously carries the tradition forward, but if someone tries to sell to you the idea that Francis is upending or repudiating or reversing the previous tradition of the Church on this point, it's just total fantasy. Okay, it's somebody who simply has not been paying attention. Okay? Third, this is going to be presented to you, this encyclical, as a historic kiss and make up, a historic reconciliation with the world of science. And based upon what I just said a moment ago, you should already grasp why this is fallacious, because the truth of it is, the Church and science, though it's like a marriage. They have experienced moments of tension, but they have remained in relationship with one another over the centuries. Now, fortunately, we have already had something of a trial run for this particular bit of misrepresentation. This trial run came last October. Do you remember last October there was a brief media frenzy because in a talk to a group of scientists in the Vatican, Pope Francis said, evolutionary theory is not opposed to the theology of creation. Okay? And for about 48 hours, this was spun up as some kind of, historic, breakthrough in terms of Catholic teaching. And then somebody gently, and I was one of the people involved in this, had to point out, in 1950, Pope Pius XII issues an encyclical entitled Humanae Generis, in which he gave a kind of conditional approval to evolutionary theory. He said it is acceptable to entertain this as a hypothesis. He made a strong distinction between the spiritual dimension of the human person, in which he said that is created directly by God, and the physical dimension of the human person, which is entirely legitimate to believe it may have developed over the centuries, over the millennia. We can bring this all the way forward to John Paul II, who famously in 1994 said that evolution is more than a hypothesis. More than a hypothesis. Okay, he said there is an increasing body of scientific evidence that points to this as the pathway that the Creator has used to bring a species into existence. And so there was a kind of embarrassed, sort of hand-wringing response in the media industry a year ago, having to back away from this artificial narrative that we had created of some kind of huge inversion of the Church's traditional position. You would like to think that that will serve as a cautionary tale for coverage of this encyclical. However, ladies and gentlemen, all I can tell you is that 20 years of being in the media business teaches me we barely remembered what happened earlier today, let alone what happened last October. So I'm not sure this is going to serve as a fire break, but nevertheless, it is something there that is on the record. All right, final point. This encyclical is going to be presented to you as another confirmation that Pope Francis belongs on the political left, okay, that he is a strong political liberal. And again, it's not that that is entirely misrepresentative, but I think it sort of misses the point. Here's the thing. First of all, we'll start with this observation, that in general, political labels are a poor fit for religious realities. Okay, this business of dividing people up into left and right, it comes out of the French Revolution, right? The left wing and the right wing of the French Parliament. Catholicism has a bit more history, before we got around to the French Revolution. So our categories significantly predate the rise of modern secular politics. And they generally distort more than they reveal. I mean, we all know, I presume, that if you take the full range of Catholic social teaching seriously, you're not going to feel comfortable in any of the major political alignments, either in the United States or any other developed Western nation. Many of us in this room are friends with John Carr, who used to be the domestic policy guy for the U.S. Bishops' Conference for many years. And John has a great line. He says that if you take Catholic social teaching seriously, in the United States, you are destined to be politically homeless. Okay? And there is a great deal of truth to that. That's the big picture. Now let's come to Francis specifically. First of all, Francis is not an American. Well, I mean, he's an American in the sense the Vatican uses the term, okay, which is, you know, from the top of Canada to Tierra del Fuego. But in the sense we use the term, okay, he's not, certainly does not come from the United States. He's not a Westerner, okay? And you need to understand that this business of dividing people up into left and right is largely an artifact of Western culture, okay? People in other parts of the world don't naturally think in these terms. Remember, when I was doing a book a number of years ago, I went for the first time to Uganda. And there was, I was in Kampala, and I went to the main university in Kampala, and there was a Catholic student center there, and they asked me to give a talk. And so I went in, and I can't even remember what I was talking about. But at the end of it, you know, we had some time for Q&A, and I said, listen, before we get to your questions, I would like to ask you people a few things. And I don't know, there were maybe 30 or 40, you know, 20-year-old Ugandans in the room. And one of the questions I asked them was, would you guys describe yourselves as liberals or conservatives? Okay, and it was clear that the question didn't really register. Okay, so I said, all right, let me try something easier. This was during the Bush years, right? So I said, all right, George Bush, do you like him or not? Okay, and you know, the answer was, well, I mean, you know, he's done some good things for Africa. We're not so hot in the war in Iraq, and so you know, we went through like, you know, 15 minutes in which I was trying to unpack what Americans mean by liberals and conservatives. And at the end of it, this one young man who was kind of the spokesperson for the group got up and said, well, listen, I mean, based on what you've said, I think the only honest answer we can give you is that we're both. Can you mean it? Okay, so this business that you have to pick one or the other, I'm trying to tell you, while it seems very natural to us, okay, these are categories that resonate with us. They don't necessarily resonate in the rest of the world. They certainly don't resonate in a place like Argentina. If you ask Pope Francis, what is his political affiliation, do you know what he's going to tell you? Because I've had this experience. What he's going to tell you is, I come out of the moderate wing of the Peronist movement. Now raise your hand if you have any idea what in the hell that means, because I certainly don't, okay? And most Argentinians I have met can't actually explain it, by the way. But in any event, he doesn't recognize this taxonomy in terms of left and right. And so, therefore, I think any attempt to sort of force him, to compel him, to cajole him into one of our two recognized categories is ultimately going to distort who the man really is. You know, in terms of this narrative that's been created of him as some kind of a raging liberal, there certainly are elements to support that. But on the other hand, it tends to leave out of view a lot of things that don't cohere with the narrative. I mean, we could, for example, talk about the incredibly strong pro-life positions that he has taken over the 2.5 years of his papacy, with language that at times, I think, would embarrass even the most outspoken pro-lifer in the States. I mean, in his speech to the Vatican Diplomatic Corps a year ago, he defined abortion as, and this is a direct quote, the most horrific of crimes. The most horrific of crimes. We could talk about his repeated insistence that marriage is a relationship between a man and a woman that is open to new life. We could talk about the way that every time he's gone to the developing world, he has talked about what he describes as the ideological colonization of the developing world by the Western powers, which basically means ramming liberal, permissive, secular values down their throats. No one has spoken against that more strongly than this Pope. Or, you know, we could mention the towering point that he has been the supreme pontiff of the Catholic Church for 2.5 years and has yet to change a single comma in the Catechism, which is the authoritative compendium of church teaching. I mean, again, to give it to you in a soundbite, ladies and gentlemen, Che Guevara in a cassock, Pope Francis is not. Okay? Now, that is not to say he is an arch-conservative. I think, you know, if you're going to insist on using an ideological label, probably the only one that even comes close to making any kind of sense is a moderate. But the point is that when this encyclical comes out, because in the politics of the West, and particularly the politics of the United States, because advocacy on behalf of climate change, global warming, and environmental protection is typically perceived as a liberal or progressive political position. And because we already have this narrative in place that that's who Francis is, I guarantee you that this encyclical is going to be used as Exhibit A in making that argument. And what I'm trying to tell you is that if you can look beyond the self-imposed American categories for a moment and allow Pope Francis to be who he really is, rather than forcing him to cohere to one of our taxonomies, you will discover that trying to pigeonhole him as either liberal or conservative ultimately is unsatisfactory, that at the end of the day, what you have is a Latin American pastor who takes the teaching and the tradition of the church for granted and is trying to bring it to bear creatively on situations of suffering that he has seen with his own eyes. You want a label for this man? Forget liberal, conservative, Latin American pastor with a heart. Okay, that's who you've got. Okay? Final thought. I have given you several instances in which I would suggest that this encyclical is likely to be misunderstood and misrepresented. And I understand that that misrepresentation and miscasting can at times seem irritating. It can seem frustrating. There is the tendency sometimes to become mad, right? To become angry at the way that some media outlets and some pundits and some advocacy groups seem determined, okay, to get this wrong, to get this kind of thing wrong. And I understand there is a temptation to anger. Believe me, when my phone goes off at 3 o'clock in the morning asking me to respond to this kind of thing, I get mad too. But I want to end with one final thought about the best way to respond to these kinds of misimpressions. Because I think what we have gathered in this room tonight, in addition to the participants in the ongoing conference, we also have a lot of people in this room who would probably score pretty high on most charts of Catholic literacy. And so my not-so-subtle suggestion here tonight is that when these misrepresentations start to occur, that all of us who are gathered here can play a role in trying to correct them and trying to reframe the discussion in a more constructive fashion. So the question is, how do we do that? Okay? And what I want to suggest to you is the winning strategy is not to do it by getting angry. The winning strategy is to do it with a sense of humor. Okay? Because if you can do that, then half the battle is already done. And the good news, ladies and gentlemen, I want to give you a kind of inspirational tale. I want to leave you on an up note, okay, about how you can find a lively sense of humor in the church, even in the most wildly improbable places. And so I want to end tonight with a story not about the current Pope, not about Pope Francis, but his predecessor, Pope Benedict, who, as you know, in the court of public opinion was sometimes seen as a somewhat dour, aloof, ethereal, sort of unapproachable figure. I sometimes said to my colleagues, the problem with you people is that when Pope Benedict walks into a room, you hear the Imperial Death March from Star Wars going off in your heads, And yet, the truth of it is, he actually had a marvelous sense of humor. And so let me leave you with a story about Pope Benedict to make this point. This goes back to 2005. This is, the death of John Paul and the election of Benedict, right? Now, that conclave generated enormous interest around the world, and you all, as media-savvy Americans, know that whenever there's great interest in a global news event, what follows that, as surely as night follows day, is that there's going to be a cottage industry of Instabooks looking to cash in on that interest, right? And the way I know is that I produced my own Instabook during that period called The Rise of Benedict XVI. Now, there is a tradition in the Vatican Press Corps that when one of us writes a book about the Holy Father, we inscribe a copy to him, and then we give it either to his priest secretary or his spokesperson or somebody, to be presented to the Pope. So, my book comes out. The Pope is elected in April. I write the book in May. It comes out June 1. I dutifully inscribe my copy. I give it to Joaquin Navarro-Valls, who at the time was still the Pope's spokesperson. And I forget about it, because to be honest with you, it had never entered my mind for a second that the Pope would actually read it. I mean, what I envisioned was a box in the basement of the Apostolic Palace, where all these books gather dust, right, over the years. So flash forward to August. My wife and I are back in the States on vacation because Benedict, unlike Francis, actually took a summer vacation. He usually went up to northern Italy. So we're in western Kansas, which is where I grew up. Okay? Visiting, at the time, my grandma would have been, what, 95, I think. So we were visiting my 95-year-old grandma, who lived in a small western Kansas town called Hill City, which, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, is my candidate for the worst place name in America, because there is no hill and there sure as hell is no city. Okay? I mean, listen, just to give you a sense of the kind of place I'm talking about, the only time anybody ever comes to Hill City, unless you have family, is like in the fall, because that's pheasant hunting season. Do you know what a pheasant is? It's a little game bird, kind of like a turkey. Listen, I made something like 70 trips with John Paul II. I did all 21 of Benedict's foreign trips. I've done all of Francis's trips. I've traveled on my own widely around the world. I mean, I've been around. But the one hotel in Hill City, America, it's called the 11 rooms, it's called the Western Hills Motel. Only place I've ever stayed in on God's green earth where there is a laminated sign in the bathroom that reads, "Please do not gut your birds in the sink." I'm not making this up. The first time I took my wife there, she said, "Is this some kind of weird sexual double entendre?" I say, "No, honey, this is face value stuff. They mean it, you know?" Anyway, that's the environment I'm talking about. So there we are in Hill City, America, and my cell phone goes off. And you know how on your phone it tells you who's calling, right? So I could tell it was Joaquin Navarro-Vos. So I picked up the phone, and he says to me, "John, I wanted you to know that the Holy Father came down to breakfast this morning with your book in his hands, and he asked me to deliver to you a personal message." Right? Yeah. I mean, I don't know about you, but if you've just been told that the Holy Father, okay, the Vicar of Christ on earth, has a personal reaction to something you've written about him, I would want to be sure your tray table is in a full upright and locked position, right? But anyway, you know, I say to Joaquin, well, of course, you know, what's the message? Now, to get this, you have to understand that my book was divided into thirds, okay? So the first part were the final days of John Paul II. The middle part was the inside story of how Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger was elected as the Pope. And the last third were sort of my projections about where his papacy was going to go, okay? So Joaquin says, Holy Father's message was the following. Please thank Herr Dr. Allen for having written this book, particularly the last third about the future of my papacy, because it has saved me the trouble of thinking about it for myself. I like to think he was kidding. Ladies and gentlemen, I would suggest on this front, as on so many others, we take our cue from the Holy Fathers, plural, not any one in particular, but the long tradition of supreme pontiffs in the Catholic Church, which is that if we can take an unflinching look at the challenges before us, in this specific case, the challenge of misrepresentation and distortion of what Pope Francis has to say about care of God's creation, but if we can do that with a twinkle in our eye rather than rage in our heart and bile in our spleen, then, ladies and gentlemen, that is a winning strategy for communications every day of the week and twice on Sunday. Thank you. God bless you. God bless the University of St. Thomas. And folks, viva el Papa!
Yes. Because you never do it in the piazza.
Never. Never.
Yeah.
We can hear each other. There's a mic over there, but I think the easiest thing to do is to, John has agreed to have some time for questions.
I didn't know it was optional.
It was, and obviously he has said a lot, and I'm sure there's lots to talk about. And I'll let him field his own questions. So feel free to raise your hand. Dr. Sullivan, I see, is the first one up. So if you can do exactly what she did, stand up and speak clearly, and then John will talk. So thank you.
Well, somebody should be.
But thank you for being here. I get a picture, please.
What's your question?
I always enjoy your insight.
Well, I enjoy your taste in literature.
So, the Pope will be coming to the United States.
Yes, he will.
What do you speculate will be the most impactful
Okay, so in case you didn't hear the questions, the Pope is coming to the United States, and it's in September. He's going to be beginning in Washington, then going to New York, then Philadelphia for a World Congress of Families. And prior to all of that, he has announced that he's going to be making a stop in Cuba along the way. So those of us on the plane will be going to Cuba first and then to the States. I hope they'll smooth over the passport thing for us because, the Americans on the plane might have an issue with that. What will be the most impactful element of that trip for the Church in the States? Look, I think if you ask the Vatican at any time, what is the purpose of any given trip? I mean, for example, the Pope is going to Sarajevo on Saturday. Okay? Now, if I called up a Vatican spokesperson or the Secretary of State right now and asked them, what's the purpose of that trip? Or he's going to Latin America in July. If I asked them, what's the point of that trip? The answer is always the same. The answer is the fundamental purpose of this trip is to confirm the brothers and sisters in the faith in that place. Okay? And I think in many ways that probably will likely be the deepest impact of Francis's arrival in the States. But I assume that's not what you're asking. So let me give you a more political and journalistic answer to the question. I would say a couple of things. One, it is very clear to me, I have a piece on our website today in which I say that if you want to understand Pope Francis's priorities, his agenda, you don't need to get a theologian, you don't need to talk to his aides, all you need to do is talk to his travel agent. Because you can discern from the places he has chosen to travel, why has he gone to Albania, Sarajevo, and Sri Lanka in the first two years of his papacy? Because these are all places that were ripped apart by an internal conflict that have found a path to peace, and he wants to lift up that example to the world. Okay? Why did he go to the Holy Land? Why did he go to Korea? And why is he going to the Central African Republic later this year? Because these are places that are currently lacerated by conflict. And he wants to try to galvanize momentum to healing them. So I would certainly expect that America's role in the world, okay, both in terms of our capacity to heal conflicts and also our occasional tendency to stoke them, okay, I think that's going to be a major theme of his commentary. Certainly, this is a pope for whom immigrants are an enormously important pastoral and biographical concern. Let us not forget that Jorge Mario Bergoglio is the son of immigrants. Okay, his family immigrated to Argentina in the late 1920s from the Piedmont region of Italy at a time when Italy was going through an economic implosion which shaped the way for the rise of Mussolini's fascist movement. His family had been devastated, and they picked up everything and went to Argentina and made a new life. So he feels in his bones, the challenges that immigrants face. As a Latin American pastor, he has obviously seen wave after wave after wave of his own people depart in search of new opportunities someplace. So certainly that's going to be a major sort of piece of subtext. And I expect, all of that will both challenge and console elements of American society and of the American church. We're going to have a great deal to talk about. But you asked, what's the most impactful thing? I think in many ways Pope Francis has already accomplished the most impactful thing before he ever sets foot on American soil. I get this question from my colleagues in the media a lot because we reporters, we are all, no matter what we do, basically we are all political reporters. Okay, at the end of the day, okay, that's how we see the world, is through the lens of politics. And so if you have a leader who is not changing policy, then we tend to think they're not doing anything. Okay? So my colleagues will always ask me, when is Francis going to get around to actually doing anything? Of course, by which they mean, changing church teaching on gay marriage or changing church teaching on abortion or whatever. I mean, any of the hot button issues. And, what I'm constantly struggling to explain to them is that policy is not the only way and probably not even the most important way to change the church. Because in the church, we have both policy and pastoral application of policy, and in terms of individual people's experience, that pastoral application is actually far more important. The other issue is, I would say that the real Francis revolution has already happened. I mean, it's not how he's reforming the Vatican's financial system as profoundly important as that is. It's not the kinds of bishops he's appointing, although that's tremendously important too. The fundamental Francis revolution is this. Do you all remember where we were as a Catholic Church on March 12th, 2013? the day before Francis was elected in terms of how the rest of the world saw us? Because I do. I was sitting on a TV platform in Rome during those days. You know what we were talking about? We were talking about child sexual abuse scandals. We were talking about painful financial embarrassments in the Holy See. We were talking about bruising political controversies around the world. We were talking about crackdowns on nuns in the United States and other parts of the world. And look, it's not as if those stories have entirely gone away. I mean, they're important and they continue to be with us. But what were we talking about as of the morning of March 14th, 2013? We were talking about rock star Pope takes the world by storm and gives the church a new lease on life. In an instant, Francis reframed public impressions of the Catholic Church, and he took a world that had either tuned us out a long time ago or had learned to look at us exclusively through the lens of suspicion and skepticism and hostility, and suddenly gave them a reason to look at us again, in this case with sympathetic interest. You want to ask me what's impactful about this Pope? Folks, that's it. Okay? And now the $64,000 question is, now that the rest of the world is looking at us once again for the first time in many cases, sympathetically looking at us, what are they going to see? That's the question. From an evangelical point of view, that's the question I'd want to ask. Are they going to see a kind of war of all against all, in which all the different tribes in the Catholic world are constantly at one another's throats, arguing over the precise meaning of every ablative absolute that flows out of this Pope's mouth? Okay. Or are they going to see a community of people, despite its differences, coming together to try to realize that iconic vision the Pope has given us of the Church as the field hospital of humanity, the place where the wounds of a hurt and broken and bruised world go to be cured? And that's not a question Francis can answer. We have to answer that question. Okay? So I would suggest that the Pope's primary impact is already in place. The question now is, what impact are we going to bring to bear to take advantage of the missionary and evangelical moment he's given us? Yes?
So I'm a climate scientist here at St. Thomas, and I also work on communicating climate science to the public. And I've watched the preemption of this encyclical in the press, and it's been, in some cases, pretty vicious. You talked about a reframe, but I am hoping that the Pope, with the sophisticated PR people around him, is...
Sorry.
I mean, I'm imagining that there's embargoed copies of this encyclical out to a ton of reporters who will create the frame. Is there a plan, do you know a plan to actually create the frame rather than just react to a negative frame?
What you're asking is an utterly logical and intelligent question that is unfortunately completely divorced from the reality of the Vatican. I mean, listen, my man, whole graduate theses could be written about how not to run a communications operation simply by watching the Vatican in action. So let me tell you how this is going to work, okay? Generally speaking, when the Vatican has a major document, okay, now what you say, it makes all the sense in the world, right? I mean, you would think that there would be a communications war room, okay, that would sit down 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month in advance of release of the document and say, who are the market movers out there, right? I mean, who are the print reporters, the TV people, the bloggers that we know are going to shape reaction to this document, right? And you'd want to make sure that they had embargoed, if you know what that means, a copy of the document. You can't actually print it or write about it, but you have it in advance, okay, so you can get ready. You'd want to give them access to, the movers and shakers who had worked on the document. Maybe you'd want to bring a representative group in to do a Q&A with the Pope, because the Pope obviously cares deeply about this document, and he loves talking to people. He'd do it. I mean, I know he'd do it. I've seen him do it on the plane. I mean, actually, his handlers normally halfway into these things try to drag him back into business class, and he refuses. So I know he'd do it. And you would try to say, okay, let's bring 6, 8, 10 of these people, over to the Santa Marta where the Pope is living, and let's do an embargoed Q&A, that can run the day the document appears to help set that frame. All of that makes all the sense in the world. None of it is going to happen. Okay? What is instead going to happen is that the Vatican Press Office is going to put out a statement saying, 2 days ahead of the release date, that we are going to have a press conference on the 16th with, 2 or 3, whatever, not the Pope, but, 2 or 3 other people. That the Encyclical, and the press conference will be at noon. The Encyclical will be available under embargo at 9 o'clock that morning, which means that most journalists will have a grand total of 3 hours, to get ready to report whatever it is they're going to report. The press conference is going to be anodyne and completely unhelpful. And so, what most people will do is pick 2 or 3 graphs almost at random out of the text that they think are like the sexiest language they could find in a hurry, and then they'll throw in some graphs from what will be an avalanche of emails from advocacy groups on all sides of this question that are going to be floating around. And that will become the kind of 600 or 800 word story. And by the way, all of this is assuming that the normal thing doesn't happen, because the normal thing is when there's a major papal text, it may be, its official release may be on June 16th, but normally, you can bet your last dollar that it's going to be leaked to the Italian press 2 or 3 days in advance. And so excerpts of it will start appearing on the 12th, 13th, and 14th, and the Vatican won't comment on them because it's their practice never to comment on anything that's been leaked. So you could stand up if you wanted and say this encyclical means that the Pope has declared that, Mars is made of Swiss cheese, and there would be no official denial of that, until the 16th. I mean, you think I'm kidding? I mean, folks, let me tell you a story, okay? This goes back to 2011. There was a scandal that arose in Italy, the details of which are way too complicated for me to go into. But basically, there was an Italian journalist, very well-known Italian journalist, who was accused of, first of all, of being gay, and secondly, of having illegally harassed or stalked or whatever his gay lover. And at the bottom of that report was a supposed police document that was published in all the Italian papers. Okay, now 2 days later, it turned out the police document was totally fake. Somebody had whipped it up on Photoshop. So then the question became, who was behind this, right? And believe it or not, the Italian media sort of collectively decided, because they've never seen a conspiracy theory they're not ready to believe, okay? So they collectively decided that this had to be a conspiracy that involved the head of the Vatican Security Service, a guy by the name of Domenico Gianni. It had to involve the editor of the Vatican newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano, a guy by the name of Gian Maria Vian, and the Secretary of State, like the #2 guy in the system after the Pope, okay, who at the time was an Italian cardinal by the name of Tarcisio Bertone. Now, the thing about this is, aside from just the moral improbability that people like that would be involved in such a thing, it just never made any sense at all, because if you're the Secretary of State, if you're the second most powerful man in the Catholic Church, and you want to get the editor of the Italian bishop's newspaper fired, you have far simpler ways of doing it, right? You pick up the phone and say, get rid of this guy, right? You don't need to concoct some, wild plot that comes straight out of an episode of 24, So it never made any sense at all. But this was, I swear to God, this was the lead item in all the Italian newspapers. It was the top item on all the nightly news shows. It was what everyone was talking about. And for 18 straight days, the Vatican said absolutely nothing about it. Okay, and then finally, on the 19th day, they issued a denial. And do you know what the headline in the main paper in Italy the next day was? La Santa Sede nega tutto, nessuno ci crede. Which means the Holy See denies everything, no one believes it. I mean, that's how bad this is. So, look, part of the reason that I wanted to give this talk here tonight was at least some kind of preemptive strike, to warn about some pitfalls in interpretation that may be out there. But obviously, the far more helpful thing would be if the Vatican would do that itself and be crafty about the way this is presented and packaged. I'm just telling you, don't count on it, okay? Which is why, to repeat, I am saying that in many ways, those of us in this room here tonight are going to have to help pick up some of that slack, because the initial presentation probably, if past experience is any guide, is not going to do the trick. Yes?
Yeah, hi. I was wondering, since you spent so much time around popes and you've traveled with them and you see Pope Francis like in person, some people say that he speaks off the cuff and just doesn't care about what the media is going to do, just because that's just who he is. He's salt of the earth guy.
Yeah.
He uses
And so the question is, which is true?
Or is he both? Or how do you, I mean, how
Yeah.
do you read him as a reporter? Since you, I mean, just,
Well, listen, you've tipped my hand, because I get this question a lot, right? Is all of this calculated, or is it sincere, is the way it's usually presented to me. And rather than just answering that in a very annoying fashion, I go off on this whole jag, the synthesis of which is, Catholicism, to quote Benedict XVI, we are the great tradition of both and. You know, I mean, Protestantism is the tradition of either or, right? Scripture, not tradition, right? You know, that kind of thing. Whereas we are Scripture and tradition, and so forth and so on. So basically my answer is both of these things are true. It is true that Pope Francis is a very spontaneous figure who is not controlled or spun or manipulated by anyone. I mean, I've seen him in action up close and personal, and I guarantee you there are times when some of his media gurus wish they could run to the Vatican pharmacy to stock up on heart pills because, you know, they're dying. I mean, you know, I was on the plane when do you remember that famous soundbite he gave about how Catholics don't have to breed like rabbits? Remember that? You should have seen the face of the papal spokesperson when he said that. Manny, I'm sorry, man, but this may be your future, but I'm telling you, make sure you got good life insurance, all right? Because, you know, if this guy sticks around. And so there is that element. But on the other hand, this Pope is the furthest thing in the world from naive, okay, or unaware. You know, I mean, I usually say that if you want a 5-star banner headline into Pope Francis, you know, an insight you dare not forget, here it is. Beneath that humble, simple exterior lies the mind of a brilliant Jesuit politician. Okay, this guy knows what he's doing all of the time, and there's a game plan. And so, you know, if the question is, when he, you know, sort of shoots from the hip sometimes, okay, is that just naivete? Does he not really mean it? Okay, no. You know, there is an agenda. Now, on the other hand, in every one of those moments, has he always calculated precisely what the reaction to that may be and desires it? You know, no. I would say instead that what he says is an indication of his worldview and his broad agenda. And I think what he has at the end of the day, to be honest with you, is enough serenity, you know, interior freedom to say, okay, I'm just going to say this, and if it's misunderstood in this moment, I have enough confidence to believe that in the long run, when the dust settles, okay, what I was trying to do will be clear. I mean, listen, if you want to me, the key insight into Pope Francis, it is this. This comes from the book, because actually, Jonathan, all due apologies, The Global War on Christians was not my most recent book. My most recent book was actually titled The Francis Miracle from Time, last year. And I have a sort of story, a previously untold story in that book, which I do think illustrates a great deal about this Pope, which is this. From the outside, the great mystery that has to be unraveled about Pope Francis is how do you account for the jarring difference between the Cardinal Bergoglio of Buenos Aires and the Pope Francis we see today? Now, when I say jarring difference, there certainly are many elements that unite the two figures. I mean, his commitment to the poor was clear. His humility and simplicity of lifestyle was clear. His emphasis on good governance. He launched an ambitious financial reform in Buenos Aires the same way he's done in the Vatican. So there are many things that are similar. But here's the jarring difference. The jarring difference is this. When he was in Buenos Aires, for the 15 years he was the Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Jorge Maria Bergoglio hated appearing in public. He did it extremely rarely. And when he did, his friends would say he came off as shy. His critics would say he came off as boring. But in any event, no one accused him of turning the world on with his smile. In fact, just as an exercise, go home tonight and fire up Google on your computer and go to the images section and type in Cardinal Bergoglio and not Pope Francis. I defy you to find a picture of him when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires and when he was captured smiling. You won't find it. It just didn't exist. Okay? So, and I mean, just to cap all this off, just so you know it's not my personal impression, when I was down there shortly after his election, I interviewed his sister, Maria Elena, his only surviving sibling. And I asked her, what do you make of the contrast between your brother here in Argentina and the guy who's now Pope? And she's like, I don't recognize this guy. Where is my brother Jorge, and what have you done with him? You know? So how do you explain all that? Well, I've asked this question to everybody who moves, of course, because it is kind of the central enigma in many ways about Francis. And the most convincing answer I got came from another Latin American cardinal, a guy I know very well. I got to know back in the 90s, who, at the time I was doing the book, so this is now a year and a half ago, he had had an hour or so of private time with the Pope, because they're old friends, right? So it had just been the two of them sitting around the Santa Marta chatting. And I asked him, so what'd you learn? And he said, well, you know, I asked him, what's happened to you? Because, you know, you're not the guy I knew in Buenos Aires, so what's going on? Okay? And this cardinal quoted the Pope's response as follows. He said that Francis said to him, the night of my election, I had an experience of the closeness of God in a moment of prayer, which gave me a sense of interior freedom and interior peace that has never left me. Never left me. And you know, the confirmation of that is the guy who runs Vatican TV, they actually have video of the Pope, the new Pope, coming out of the Sistine Chapel and going out in the balcony and all that. And if you look at it, when Francis walks out of the Sistine Chapel, his eyes are cast down on the ground, his shoulders are slumped over, and he kind of looks like a man who has the weight of the world on him. But then instead of veering immediately out into the balcony to do the blessing, he walks down to the end of the hall and he goes into the Pauline Chapel, which is at the opposite end of the Hall of Blessings in the Vatican from the Sistine. And he goes in for a few moments of personal, silent, private prayer. And the TV cameras captured him when he came out of the chapel, and his eyes are lit up. You know, his body language is completely different. He's expansive, he's smiling. And he boldly strides out onto the loggia looking over the square, and you know, we all know the story from there. But the point is, the reason I called that book The Francis Miracle is because the Pope believes there is an actual miracle at the heart of the kind of Pope he's become, a kind of transformative spiritual experience that has freed him up. So back to your question. When he displays this freedom, you know, this spontaneity, this openness, this shoot-from-the-hip style, yes, there's a political calculation to it, but the political calculation isn't necessarily that tomorrow this is going to work the way that I intend, but somehow there is a sense of confidence that ultimately, in the long run, you know, people will understand what I'm about. Right? Are you pulling the plug? Is that what this is? Okay, before they turn off my microphone, let me just say one more thing. First of all, I don't want you to leave without at least one decent Pope joke, so here we go. Pope walks into a bar with a frog on his shoulder. Bartender looks up and says, hey, that's kind of cool, where'd you get it? And the frog says, Buenos Aires. Secondly, I don't just want to parachute out of here and have no further contact with you, so let me make this offer to you. If I can ever be of use to anyone in this room, you know, if you need a contact or, I don't know, you know, you need to do some Vatican rumor control or, I mean, for God's sakes, folks, if you're coming to Rome and you want restaurant recommendations, this is where I really shine. Whatever it is, I'd be delighted to try to be of help to you. The Globe sponsors a website devoted to Catholic coverage that is called Crux, C-R-U-X. You can find it at www.cruxnow.com. My articles are always on there. My email address is at the bottom of every article, and I do receive those emails. Now, if you're going to do that, I mean, please put University of St. Thomas or something in the subject line, so I don't think you're the 9th Nigerian prince today who is going to give me $30 million if I just give you my credit card details. But, you know, assuming you permeate my spam filter, if I can be of assistance to you, I'd be delighted to do that. Okay? Thank you. God bless.